Convicted terrorist Abdul Nacer Benbrika will stay in an Australian jail after Victoria's Supreme Court deemed him too risky to release. Benbrika was jailed in 2009 after authorities uncovered he was a, quote, guiding light for a terror cell accused of planning attacks on high-profile targets and discussing the assassination of then Prime Minister John Howard. Reporter Danny Tran reports from Melbourne.
Abdul Benbrika has completed his 15-year sentence behind bars. He today learned that he would be there for another 3 years. Commonwealth lawyers have convinced the Victorian Supreme Court to issue a continuing detention order, meaning that Benbrika will remain behind bars until 2023. Justice Andrew Tinney today ruled it would be too risky to release Benbrika back into the community. In 2009, the now 60-year-old was convicted of leading a terror cell accused of planning high-profile attacks and planning or talking about assassinating then Prime Minister John Howard.
Okay, and Danny, what happens now?
Well, Benbrika today appeared from Victoria's maximum security Barwon prison, and he didn't react as the decision was handed down. He'll stay in prison until December 2023. Of course, this comes after his citizenship was stripped last month. Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton making that decision. Benbrika is now on an ex-citizen visa, which means he can remain in Australia, but he will not be able to re-enter. The question now for Benbrika and his lawyers is whether this decision will be appealed. But on the face of things, it appears that Benbrika will be in prison for another 3 years.
For more, I'm joined by Greg Barton, who's the Chair of Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University. Professor Barton, do you agree with the argument that was made by the federal authorities that Benbrika posed too great a risk to be released?
Liza, we haven't heard the full evidence that the court heard, but there does appear to be a very strong case for continuing detention. It's only a 3-year period. It could be extended for a further 3 years. It seems unfair that somebody who's served their time is not released. But the precedence for this is people involved in violent assault, often violent sexual assaults, who, if they're released, are a threat to society. Of course, it's a little different for Benbrika, but the prospect that he would influence young people to go on and commit terror attacks needs to be taken very seriously. So it's regrettable, but it seems like it's unavoidable.
So can you just remind us of Benbrika's ideology and what he was convicted of?
At the time he was arrested in November 2005, ultimately 9 men in a group with him in Melbourne and another 9 men in another group in Sydney were inspired by Al-Qaeda, and they looked to Benbrika as their spiritual leader, and they wanted to carry out some kind of Al-Qaeda style terror attack. They were under police surveillance for over a year, a very extensive operation, very extensive court trial. Of course, it's not easy to prove what somebody might have done given a chance to think that they can get a chance to do anything. Unfortunately, many of these 18 men and their extended families have been involved in the Islamic State and the next wave of terrorism since, and Benbrika is seen as an influence in that. So hence that's the concern that if he were to be released today and back into society, that influence would continue.
I was going to ask you about that because, you know, in 2005, 2009, when he was convicted, IS wasn't around. But we do know that, for instance, Abu Bakr Bashir, who was the spiritual leader in Indonesia of Jemaah Islamiyah, went on to espouse or agree with perhaps IS ideology. Do we know anything about what's happened to Benbrika in the time he's been in jail?
It seemed like he was dropping out of public interest. It was a bit of a yesterday's man until the declaration of the IS caliphate in mid-2014. Then suddenly he said he was going to support Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the caliph, and suddenly he got new notoriety. He was once again back in the frame of attention. Now we think of names like Khalid Sharoof and Mohammed El Omar. Khalid Sharoof was one of those 9 men in New South Wales who was sentenced. A short sentence, used his brother's passport to go to Syria, joined by Mohammed El Omar, whose uncle was one of the other 9 men in New South Wales. So they made a switch from a group, started supporting Al-Qaeda, and then as Al-Qaeda evolved in Iraq and became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, they joined that. And quite a large number of the 18 men who were sentenced, either them or their nephews, extended family members, became involved with ISIS. So it's a pretty serious outcome. Now, to what extent Benbrika was directly responsible is debatable. But what's pretty clear is that people looked to him as the spiritual leader. They wanted his authority, they wanted his legitimacy to give them blessings to go and become foreign terror fighters. And unfortunately, that resulted in a lot of Australians taking the lives of other people and losing their own lives. Very, very tragic outcome.
Now, Benbrika has had his citizenship revoked in jail. So if he is actually eventually freed at some point, be that 2023 or later, what happens to him?
Well, in theory, he could be deported back to Algeria, his place of birth, whether, of course, Algeria wants to take him back is another question. He could be taken into immigration detention pending deportation. Of course, the worry is that if he were deported back to North Africa, he might be very likely allowed to roam free and get caught up again with terrorist groups in North Africa and their ongoing influence. Any Australian, unfortunately, wherever they are in the world, is likely to be seen as a source of inspiration and influence to people back in Australia. So just getting them offshore doesn't make their influence go away, not in the age of social media and the way we saw ISIS recruiting work. So we're really between a rock and a hard place with Benbrika. Getting him out of Australia wouldn't get rid of his influence. Leaving him in immigration detention would be a bad outcome. The least worst of all the outcomes at the moment is he stays where he is in prison for at least 3 years, and then a judgment has to be made again whether he's an ongoing threat or whether there are other ways of controlling his influence.
And just finally, Professor, the caliphate, in inverted commas, of IS has fallen. People like Benbrika are behind bars. How has support for these type of extremist ideologies in Australia changed over the past sort of 5 to 10 years?
Well, of course, the immediate attraction of going off to Syria, Iraq and fighting with the so-called caliphate, that's gone. But what we know from ASIO and federal and state police is that their workload in terms of counter-terrorism cases has increased significantly. Of course, it's also added to now with far-right extremist counter-terrorism cases. But it means that sort of iconic idea of joining the IS global struggle remains strong. Now, some have tried apparently to go to places like Somalia or Afghanistan or the Philippines. So there's still a danger that people may yet try and repeat that pattern we saw several years ago. It won't be the same story of going off to Syria, but it carries with it the threat that if they can't travel, they'll try and do something at home. And we've seen that pattern repeated many times over. So somebody like Benbrika, who can influence and keep that interest up, is unfortunately a real source of danger.
That's right, at home, as you mentioned, or in the Southeast Asian region. Professor Greg Barton from Deakin University, thank you very much.
Thanks, Eliza.